significance. Huge significance for extradition treaties all over the world between the United States and other countries, which are often so one-sided that they allow the US to effectively police what happens in countries across the world. But this case also has huge significance for the right.
Significado particular muy grande porque tiene que ver con la libertad de expresión a nivel mundial.
Assange is being punished for no other reason than his journalistic work and exposure of war crimes, for providing a service to humanity, for lifting the lid on human rights abuses and war crimes done by the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and often done with the support of governments all across the world. So given the global nature of this case, we need to build a movement of parliamentarians across the world speaking out and calling on the Biden administration to drop the prosecution against Julian Assange. There have been some welcome shifts by the Biden administration away from the era of Trump on issues such as climate change, and we need to ensure that there is a shift on this issue too. So today, we've got 3 sessions. This first session is one in which we will listen to 2 very important guests who will update us on this case. The first guest is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, and then we will hear from Stella Morris, Julian Assange's partner. In the second session, we will hear from parliamentarians from across the world, including from Australia, and I encourage parliamentarians from each country represented here today to speak in that second session. And then finally, we will look at the next steps that politicians can be taking with opening remarks from the former Nobel Prize winner, Adolfo Perez Esquivel, and the German Member of Parliament, Sevim Dagdelen. And we'll be wrapping up by 3 p.m. London time. So with those introductory remarks over, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our first speaker, Niels.
Thank you very much, Richard. Is the audio okay? Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for having me for this, giving me the opportunity to speak to this important audience. I think you formulated it really correctly, that this is an extremely important issue that is of great importance far beyond the person of Julian Assange. I think this case has, although obviously every case like this has a personal aspect, and I'm sure that Stella Morris afterwards will speak to that as well. But I think we all have to be to try to focus on the overall importance of this case. Myself, I was contacted.
J'ai été contacté par les avocats de Julian Assange en décembre 2018 et ils m'ont demandé.
And only once I started to look in those pieces of evidence, I realized that there really wasn't any facts to back up this narrative that I had in my own mind. So I'm telling you all of this because I think that's the most important obstacle to having a clear 2020 vision, even before 2021 this year, on this case, is that we're always looking at Julian Assange, and because most of us don't know him personally, we're looking at a persona that has been created of him or for him or in his place, mainly platforms and so on over the last 10 years. And I can assure you, I've investigated this case for 2 years. There is nothing to back up this narrative. So I obviously I could speak here in very much detail to all aspects of the investigation, but I propose that I will then answer 2 questions if people want to know more specifically about specific aspects. But I'd like to focus on the state side of this. Being prosecuted, we always look at the person. We're not looking at the prosecuting side. And I'm arguing that what's being done here is a prosecution that is not pursuing law and justice, but is pursuing political purposes. And therefore, it is a persecution. It is not a prosecution. And all of this hinges on the good faith of the prosecuting states. And here I'm talking not only about the US, of those authorities, because clearly those war crimes are much more serious than what Julian Assange could ever conceivably have been committed. None of this is being prosecuted. Persecuted. He's not even a whistleblower who's had a duty of allegiance or of secrecy. He's a publicist, a journalist who has published evidence for serious crimes. Now we can see as Swedish proceedings clear violations of his procedural rights. I can speak to that in detail if you like. Ecuador has expelled him from the embassy without any process, has taken his statehood away, his citizenship away, without any due process. In the UK proceeding, unfortunately, to my shock, and I'm a professor at the British University myself,
not Iraqi Democrat,
I could see how his rights have been systematically violated. In the US, Julian Assange would not expect a fair trial either. The good faith of those states is also disproven by the way in which they engage with my mandate. I'm mandated by states to report to states about their compliance with their obligations under the Convention Against Torture. And when I reported to those 4 states that I have be compliant with their human rights obligations, I'm not saying that they needed necessarily to agree with my findings that Julian Assange had been exposed to psychological torture, but by treaty law, they're obliged to went to visit Julian Assange in prison in May 2019, just after his arrest, together with 2 very experienced experts, medical experts, specialized in examining victims of torture. And they have worked in this for about 30 years. They have examined victims in the Balkan Wars and the Middle East. I mean, they have no reason to seek publicity. You will have noticed in the last 2 years, they have never appeared in the press. So they're not, scandal-seeking kind of people. They're very experienced, independent medical experts. Both of them and myself, we all came to the conclusion that Julian Assange showed the symptoms that are typical for victims of psychological torture. And here we're talking about ill treatment that is comparable to a type of mobbing that we would know from our private lives, or that everyone would be familiar with. It's a very common method of psychological torture because it doesn't leave physical traces, but is extremely destructive to the human mind and emotional stability in the long term. And it has several components. It always includes a form of isolation, social isolation or physical isolation. In Julian Assange's case, we progressively have both of those aspects. Then there is a threat scenario that is there, that something bad could happen. Conditions of detention for political detainees or let's say national security detainees in the US amount to inhumane and cruel treatment. And so we have the isolation, we have the threat scenario, we have the constant arbitrariness of official behavior. And here we're talking to his constant violations of his procedural rights. He doesn't get access to his lawyers. He doesn't get access to his all of this I reported to those states. And it has been confirmed by other independent medical doctors. We've had hundreds of doctors intervening internationally with the British government. We've had the European Parliament passing resolutions. We've had the International Bar Association protesting officially against the unfair trial that Julian Assange is getting. We've had Amnesty International speaking out against his extradition. Even New York Times, The Guardian, who have been critical to some aspects of WikiLeaks' work in the past, have very clearly spoken out against the unjust treatment of Julian Assange. The Working Group on Arbitrary Detention of the United Nations years ago has decided that his confinement in the embassy is arbitrary. I have investigated this case. I have no personal stakes in this case. And I was even biased, I admit it, to my shame, biased against Julian Assange in the beginning. But once I looked at the fact, it was clear that this is not a prosecution, it is a persecution. Now, let us not, and I will close on this last aspect, let us not be misled by the seemingly positive result of the judgment of 4th of January, which refuses extradition for espionage, which basically sets a precedent case that what Julian Assange has done, which is investigative journalism, is a crime under the Espionage Act. And not only that, but also under the British Official Secrets Act. So it also really concerns every single British citizen. They could be criminalized for exposing dirty secrets, if you allow me that term, of the government. And so then Julian Assange back to solitary confinement in the UK, where there is no need and no legal basis to keep him in solitary confinement. He's not serving a sentence. He is only being kept there in confinement to assure his presence in case he should be extradited. So it's a preventative detention so he doesn't escape. But you don't need solitary confinement in Belmarsh kept in house arrest. So the fact that he's being kept in an expensive solitary confinement arrangement in Belmarsh proves that the authorities have other things in mind than just assure his presence for that trial. So I think with this, I have exhausted my initial speaking time. I thank you very much for your attention. Clearly, I'm free to and willing to respond to any questions anyone might have. Thank you very much for your attention. Many thanks,
Niels, and we'll come on to questions after our next speaker. But I want to say that we've been joined since the start also by representatives from Argentina, from Belgium, and from Ireland and Norway as well. And in fact, we've had over 40 international guests registered for today's event. And I think that just goes to show the strength of feeling from parliamentarians across the globe on this crucial issue. And on that note, I'd like to invite Stella to address the meeting.
Hi, Richard. Thank you. Last Sunday was the 2-year anniversary of Julian's arrest and incarceration, and there were protests and vigils on 5 continents, and the story was in the major UK newspapers. A double-decker bus was filled with people and draped with Julian, free Assange, and it followed the path from Julian's arrest at the Ecuadorian embassy to Belmarsh prison, where Julian has been buried from public view for the past 2 years. If it weren't for Julian's calls with me and a limited number of people, he would have no idea what was going on, not only around the world, but just for Joel, who's 3. Why Daddy was speaking to them 1 second and then disappeared the next. Imagine telling them that their father wants to come home, but they won't let him yet. I don't know how to describe what I have had to witness. Terms such as monumental injustice, aberration come to mind. And I think of alluding to basic democratic principles and human rights. But all these are words that ultimately feel stale and abstract. I have not yet found the words for what we are going through. Julian is the most considerate, principled, and generous person I know. And what is being done to him is cruelty in its rawest form. Julian has spent 2 years in a high-security prison. The Obama administration decided not to charge Julian because Julian's conduct was no different to that of the rest of the press. Charging Julian would mean criminalizing journalism. Obama pardoned the alleged source, Chelsea Manning, who was free. The charges brought by Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration. To date, Julian has suffered severe punishment through process, surrounded by the worst murderers and drug dealers in Britain. He's in a prison where prisoners are killed through murder or suicide every few months. He faces 175 years, or however many life sentences, if you want to quantify. The US government says it has the prerogative to decide what foreign press can publish about its abuses committed abroad. It is extending its criminal laws to the rest of the world to prosecute a publisher who has won the highest awards for journalism for doing his job, an Australian living and working in London, Paris, and Berlin, for a Europe-based publishing organization, a card-holding member of his press union whose allegiance is to the public. Let's pause and think about what the US case against Julian is actually saying. The US government is claiming that journalists all over the world have no freedom of expression rights and protections because they are not US citizens, that US criminal laws apply to them, but the First Amendment does not, even when they are in their own countries. If everything else was the same, if Julian was in London working for WikiLeaks, but he had an American passport, then he might have a defense. But because of the single fact that he does not have an American passport, he doesn't. If the case would have been drawn out and publicly ridiculed, the case against Julian is the ultimate realization of Trump's America First policy. It has added an aggressive new dimension to American exceptionalism that removes our rights as non-Americans in our own countries and infringes our sovereignty. Reporters Without Borders and the National Union of Journalists in the UK have said that as long as Julian is in prison and faces extradition, the UK is not a safe place for journalists and publishers to work. The Trump administration advancing governments to turn. Those governments must constantly crash into this case, just like Saudi Arabia does with the Khashoggi assassination. It is too late for Khashoggi, but it is not too late for Julian. As lawmakers, you have unique avenues and powers at your disposal to press. I'd like to thank Richard Bergen for organizing the symposium, the cross-parliamentary groups in Australia, Germany, and the UK for the work they have already done to put an end to this, and to each of you individually and collectively for stepping up to save Julian's life and our collective freedoms. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. Now we have